The Eternal Light, A Journey with the Quran. It was a crisp autumn evening in Istanbul, where the golden hues of the setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber. The call to prayer echoed through the ancient streets, weaving its way through bustling markets and quiet alleyways. Amidst this timeless city, a young historian named Omar sat in the grand library of the Sultanate district, engrossed in a book that had shaped civilizations, the Quran. For years, Omar had been fascinated by history, yet he always felt that something was missing. He had studied the rise and fall of empires, the philosophies of great minds, and the revolutions that shaped nations. But despite all his knowledge, a void remained within him. One evening, as he traced his fingers over the intricate Arabic calligraphy on an ancient manuscript, an elderly librarian, Sheikh Hamid, noticed his curiosity. "You seem lost in thought, young man," the librarian said with a gentle smile. Omar hesitated before speaking. "I've read so much about the world, but I feel like I don't truly understand the essence of life itself." Sheikh Hamid nodded knowingly and handed him a different copy of the Quran, one that had been carefully preserved for centuries. "Then perhaps, instead of studying the world, you should study the book that explains its purpose." Intrigued, Omar accepted the book. That night, he began his journey through its pages, not as a scholar, but as a seeker. The revelation of truth. As Omar delved deeper into the Quran, he found himself transported to the deserts of 7th century Arabia, where a man named Muhammad received the first revelation in the cave of Hira. He imagined the trembling hands of the Prophet PBUH as he embraced the divine words for the first time. Omar could feel the weight of the message, its call to reflection, justice, and compassion. The Quran was not just a book of laws or rituals. It was a conversation, a guidance that reached beyond time and space. He read about the struggles of the early Muslims, the resilience they showed in the face of oppression, and their unwavering faith in a truth greater than themselves. For the first time, Omar saw history not as a series of disconnected events, but as a story woven by divine wisdom. The preservation of light. One evening, he came across the story of how the Quran was compiled. He read about Abu Bakr, R.A., gathering its verses, ensuring that not a single word was lost. He learned how Caliph Uthman, R.A., standardized its recitation to preserve its purity. But what struck Omar the most was how millions of people memorized the Quran, passing it down through generations without a single letter changing. No other text in human history had been preserved this way. As a historian, this fact fascinated him. It was as if the Quran was not just a relic of the past, but a living testament, still breathing, still guiding, still transforming lives. A personal awakening. One night, while reading Surah Al-Furqan, Omar came across a verse. "And the messenger will say, 'O my Lord, my people have abandoned this Quran.'" 25:30. The words hit him like a storm. He realized that he had been guilty of the very thing the verse spoke of. He had spent his life searching for answers in history books, while ignoring the one book that had been waiting for him all along. The Quran was not just a historical document or a literary masterpiece. It was a living guide, a compass for the lost, a light for those in darkness. Omar closed the book and looked out of the window at the city lights shimmering over the Bosphorus. The same Quran that had been revealed in a lonely cave had now reached every corner of the world. It had shaped civilizations, guided rulers, and comforted the hearts of the broken. And now it had transformed him. That night, Omar made a silent promise to himself to not just read the Quran, but to live by it. As he stepped out of the library, the call to prayer once again filled the air, but this time it sounded different. It was not just a call to worship. It was a call to understanding, to reflection, to a journey that would never end. The night of revelation. The night air in Mecca was thick with silence, broken only by the distant howls of desert winds. High above the city, nestled between the rugged hills, was the cave of Hira. Inside, a lone figure sat in deep contemplation, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed upon the darkness beyond. Muhammad ibn Abdullah, PBUH, had come here often, seeking solitude away from the corruption of Meccan society. The idols of the Quraysh, the injustice, and the suffering of the weak. These things troubled his heart. He knew there had to be more to life than the blind rituals his people followed. But on this night, something was different. A sudden presence filled the cave. It was overwhelming, powerful yet peaceful. Muhammad's heart pounded. His breath quickened. And then a voice, unlike any he had ever heard, rang through the darkness. Iqra. Read. His lips trembled. His body froze. I am not one who reads, he managed to whisper. The presence enveloped him again, pressing upon him, not to harm, but as if to awaken something deep within. Iqra. Terror gripped him. Was he losing his mind? Or was this something beyond human comprehension? The voice came again, filling the space around him, filling his very soul. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. Read, for your Lord is most generous. And just like that, the presence was gone. The cave fell silent once more, but the world had changed forever. Fear and understanding. Stumbling out of the cave, Muhammad's body trembled. His mind raced. He descended the rocky path, his feet unsteady. Never before had he felt such terror, such awe, such certainty and uncertainty all at once. By the time he reached home, his wife, Khadija R.A., saw the fear in his eyes. He wrapped himself in a blanket, shivering despite the warmth of the desert night. Cover me, Khadija. Cover me, he pleaded. She held him, whispering words of comfort. He told her everything. About the cave, the voice, the command to read. Khadija listened, her eyes calm, her heart unwavering. By Allah, he will never disgrace you, she reassured him. You uphold ties of kinship, you care for the poor, you help the distressed. You are a man of goodness. And with that, she took his trembling hands and led him to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, a learned Christian scholar. As Muhammad Pbuh recounted his experience, Waraka's eyes shone with recognition. This, he said, is the same revelation that came to Moses. You, Muhammad, have been chosen as a prophet of Allah. Muhammad's heart pounded. A prophet? Him? A new mission, a new struggle. In the days that followed, the revelations continued, guiding him, strengthening him. The message was clear: there is only one God, and He alone is worthy of worship. At first, Muhammad Pbuh shared the message quietly. His closest friends, Abu Bakr, Ali, Uthman, and Zaid, believed in him without hesitation. Slowly, others followed. Slaves, the poor, those searching for truth, all found solace in his words. But not everyone welcomed the message. The Quraysh, the powerful leaders of Mecca, saw this new faith as a direct threat. Their wealth, their idols, their authority, it was all built on the old ways. The idea of one God, of justice, of equality, it was too dangerous. At first, they mocked Muhammad Pbuh. A madman, they called him. A poet, a sorcerer. But when they saw Islam growing, their mockery turned into violence. Believers were beaten in the streets. Bilal, the Abyssinian slave, was tortured under the scorching sun, his body pressed against burning sand. Yasser and his wife, Sumaya, became the first martyrs of Islam, killed for refusing to renounce their faith. Yet, despite the suffering, the message did not fade. The turning point, migration to Medina. After years of persecution, Allah sent a way out. In the city of Yathrib, soon to be Medina, a group of people had embraced Islam. They invited Muhammad Pbuh and his followers to come and build a new society, one based on faith and justice. The night of migration was tense. The Quraysh had plotted to kill Muhammad Pbuh in his sleep, but by Allah's command, he escaped under the cover of darkness, with Abu Bakr by his side. As they hid in the cave of Thor, the enemy search parties came dangerously close. Abu Bakr's heart pounded with fear, but Muhammad Pbuh reassured him, "Do not grieve. Indeed, Allah is with us." Quran 9:40. Against all odds, they reached Medina safely. The city welcomed them with open arms. This was not just an escape, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Here, Islam would flourish. Here, the first Islamic state would be born. A new era begins. As Muhammad PBUH stood before the people of Medina, he knew that this was more than just migration. It was the fulfillment of Allah's plan. From the caves of Hira to the streets of Medina, the Quran had guided him every step of the way. A divine revelation had begun in the silence of a cave, and now it was about to reshape the world forever. The guardians of the revelation. A prophet's trust. The Prophet Muhammad PBUH sat in the courtyard of Masjid al-Nabawi, his eyes scanning the faces of his companions. They had gathered after the latest revelation had been sent down, eager to hear the words of Allah. Among them were scribes, men entrusted with recording the verses, carefully writing on parchment, leather, and even palm leaves. Beside them sat the Hafiz, those who had committed the Quran to memory. They recited with precision, their voices echoing through the mosque. The Quran was not just a written text. It was alive in their hearts, preserved through both ink and voice. One day, the Prophet PBUH turned to his closest companions and said, "Convey for me, even if it is one verse." This was not just a message for them. It was a responsibility, one that would ensure the Quran was preserved beyond his lifetime. The crisis after the Prophet's passing. When the Prophet PBUH passed away, the entire Muslim community was in grief. But grief quickly turned into urgency. The new leader, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq R.A., was faced with an immediate crisis, the Battle of Yamama. In this fierce battle against false claimants to prophethood, many Hafiz were martyred. Umar ibn Khattab R.A., seeing the danger, rushed to Abu Bakr. "O Abu Bakr, many who memorized the Quran have been killed. If this continues, parts of the Quran may be lost. We must collect it before it is too late." Abu Bakr hesitated. "How can I do something that the Prophet PBUH himself did not do?" But Umar persisted. "By Allah, it is a righteous act." Realizing the importance of the task, Abu Bakr R.A. turned to a young, brilliant companion, Zaid ibn Thabit R.A. "You are young and intelligent, and the Prophet PBUH trusted you as a scribe. I entrust you with compiling the Quran." Zaid felt the weight of the responsibility. "By Allah, if they had asked me to move a mountain, it would not have been as heavy as this task." But he accepted. The compilation begins. Zaid set strict conditions. He would only accept a verse if it was found both written and memorized by multiple people. He traveled across Medina, verifying every verse from multiple sources. For months, he worked tirelessly, collecting the Quran from parchment, palm leaves, bones, and the memories of the Hafiz. Finally, the first complete written compilation of the Quran was presented to Abu Bakr R.A. and later entrusted to Umar ibn Khattab R.A. and then to Hafsa bint Umar R.A., the Prophet's widow. The Quran was safe, but a new challenge would arise. The era of Uthman ibn Affan R.A. Islam was spreading beyond Arabia, into Persia, Byzantium, and Africa. With this expansion came linguistic diversity. Different tribes began reciting the Quran with slight variations in dialect and pronunciation. Disagreements arose. Once again, a concerned companion, Hudhaifa ibn al-Yaman R.A., approached the Caliph, Uthman ibn Affan R.A. "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, before this Ummah falls into division like the Jews and Christians, unify them upon one official recitation." Uthman R.A. immediately gathered the most trusted scribes, including Zaid ibn Thabit R.A. He ordered them to make a standardized copy of the Quran, ensuring that all variations were aligned with the dialect of the Quraysh, the dialect in which the Quran was revealed. Several copies were made and sent to major Islamic centers, Mecca, Kufa, Basra, Damascus. Any unofficial manuscripts were respectfully disposed of to prevent confusion. Through this monumental effort, the Uthmani Mushaf was established, the same Quran we read today. Beyond the written word, the legacy of Tajweed. Even with a standardized text, the oral tradition of the Quran remained just as important. Scholars like Ibn Kathir, Nafi, and Asim devoted their lives to the science of Tajweed, ensuring that the Quran was recited exactly as it was revealed. Generation after generation, Karis reciters, memorized and taught the Quran with precision, following strict rules of pronunciation and rhythm. In every corner of the Muslim world, from the deserts of Arabia to the mosques of Africa, from the madrasas of India to the palaces of Andalusia, the Quran was recited in the same divine melody. A timeless promise fulfilled. As the centuries passed, many texts were lost to history. Great civilizations fell, empires crumbled, but the Quran remained untouched. Why? Because Allah Himself had promised. Indeed, we have sent down the Quran, and surely we will protect it. Quran 15:9. From the time of the Prophet PBUH to the modern day, every single word of the Quran has remained unchanged. Whether written on parchment, printed in books, or stored in the hearts of millions, it stands today as the only scripture preserved in its original form. The Quran today. As the sun sets over the Grand Mosque in Mecca, thousands of worshippers stand shoulder to shoulder. A Qari begins to recite, his voice filling the sacred air. Among the crowd, a young child listens intently. He closes his eyes and whispers the words along with the reciter. He is among the new generation of Hafiz, continuing the legacy of preservation. The Quran, revealed in a cave, recorded on palm leaves, compiled by the righteous, and preserved through countless hearts, lives on. And it will live on forever. The Scholar's Quest, understanding the structure of the Quran, the mysterious order. Ali ibn Khalid, a young scholar from Baghdad, sat in the grand library of the House of Wisdom Beit al-Hikmah, surrounded by stacks of parchment and ink-stained fingers. His heart burned with a single question: why is the Quran arranged the way it is? He had spent years memorizing it, but one thing puzzled him. Unlike other books, the Quran was not in chronological order. The first revelation, Iqra, was in Surah Al-Alaq, yet the first chapter in the Mushaf was Surah Al-Fatiha. The longest surah, Al-Baqarah, appeared at the beginning, while shorter surahs were found toward the end. If the Quran is a divine book, why doesn't it follow a simple sequence, beginning, middle, and end, he thought. One evening, he decided to seek the answer from Imam Yahya, an elderly scholar known for his deep knowledge of the Quran. A conversation with the wise Imam. Ali entered the small study where Imam Yahya sat, his white beard resting against his chest as he carefully copied a manuscript. "Ya Sheikh, I have a question that has troubled me for years. Why is the Quran arranged the way it is? If it was revealed in a certain order, shouldn't it be compiled that way?" The Imam smiled. "Ah, young one, you have touched upon one of the most beautiful aspects of the Quran, its divine arrangement." He pulled out a copy of the Quran and gently turned the pages. "Tell me, do you notice a pattern in how the surahs are placed?" Ali hesitated. Some surahs are long, some short. Some have stories, while others are direct commands. "But I don't see a pattern." The Imam nodded. "That is because you are looking for a worldly pattern, linear, like a history book. But the Quran is different. It is arranged thematically, not chronologically. Thematic order, a divine structure." The Imam continued, "Each surah is placed where it is for a reason. Look at Al-Baqarah. It is the longest surah, filled with laws, history, and guidance. Now look at Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter. It is a prayer for guidance. What does this tell you?" Ali thought for a moment. "It means that before we seek laws and history, we must first ask for guidance." The Imam smiled. "Exactly. The Quran teaches us the correct approach to knowledge. First, we humble ourselves before Allah. Then we seek His commands." He then flipped to Surah Yusuf, the only surah in the Quran that tells a full story in one place. This is how Allah teaches us that some lessons require a continuous narrative. Yet, the story of Musa a.s. is spread across multiple surahs. Why? Ali raised his eyebrows. Because the story contains multiple lessons, each placed in different contexts. The Imam nodded. Yes. The Quran does not follow human storytelling rules. It places lessons where they are needed most. The power of repetition and symbolism. Ali then asked, "But why does the Quran repeat certain verses so often? I have seen the phrase, 'Which of the favors of your Lord will you deny?' repeated throughout Surah Ar-Rahman." The Imam closed the Quran and said, "Tell me, do you remember the first time you saw the ocean?" Ali smiled. "Yes, it was breathtaking." "And did you stop being amazed after the second time? Or the third?" "No," Ali admitted. "Each time it felt new." The Imam chuckled. That is why Allah repeats His signs. When something is important, we do not hear it just once. Repetition is not redundancy, it is reinforcement. The Quran's words sink deeper into the heart each time we hear them. The unmatched miracle. Ali's heart was now filled with wonder. But what about the challenge of the Quran's inimitability? The claim that no one can produce something like it. The Imam's face became serious. "Have you ever read poetry from the Jahiliyyah period?" "Yes," Ali replied. Their words were powerful, and their language unmatched. Yet, the Imam said, when the Quran was revealed, even the greatest poets of Mecca were left speechless. They could not replicate its beauty, its rhythm, or its depth. He leaned in. Even today, despite all our knowledge, no one has been able to compose something that matches its linguistic perfection, its structure, its layers of meaning. The Quran is not just a book, it is a living miracle. A newfound understanding. Ali left the Imam's study that night with his heart lighter, his mind awakened. He realized that the Quran structure was not random, it was divine. Each surah, each verse, each word was placed with purpose. The Quran was not meant to be read like a human book, it was meant to be experienced, pondered upon, and recited. That night, as he sat under the moonlight, he opened his Quran with a new perspective. This was not just a book of laws, nor just a collection of stories. It was a divine conversation, one that would guide humanity until the end of time. The journey of a skeptic, a search for truth, a restless mind. Hassan had always been a thinker. Ever since he was a child growing up in Cairo, he would question everything. Why do we exist? What is the purpose of life? The world, with all its complexities, both fascinated and confused him. By the time he reached university, Hassan had drifted away from faith. Religion, to him, seemed restrictive. The world was full of corruption, injustice, and suffering. How could a just God allow it all? One evening, as he sat in a cafe near Al-Azhar University, he overheard an old professor talking to his students about the Quran. The professor's voice was calm but firm. Islam is not just a religion of rituals. It is a complete way of life. It teaches us about justice, morality, knowledge, and accountability. Hassan scoffed. He had heard all this before, but something about the professor's confidence intrigued him. That night, he decided to read the Quran, not as a believer, but as a skeptic searching for answers. The oneness of God, a new perspective. Hassan began with Surah Al-Ikhlas. Say, He is Allah the One. Allah, the eternal refuge. He neither begets nor is born, nor is there to him any equivalent. Quran 112:1-4. The words were simple, yet profound. Unlike the complex philosophies he had studied, this concept of Tawheed, oneness of God, was clear and absolute. There was no confusion, no mythology, just one supreme creator. If God is truly one, then everything in existence must be connected through him, Hassan thought. He realized that accepting one God meant accepting that all humans were equal, regardless of race or status. That idea alone challenged his worldview. Morality and justice, the Quran's call for righteousness. As he read further, he came across verses about justice. Indeed, Allah commands justice, good conduct, and giving to relatives, and forbids immorality, bad conduct, and oppression. Quran 16 hours 90 minutes. He paused. This was the very thing that had made him reject religion in the first place, injustice in the world. Yet, the Quran was not silent about it. It condemned tyranny, corruption, and oppression, demanding that people stand for truth, even against their own families. O you who have believed, stand firm for justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or parents and relatives. Quran 4:135. This was unlike anything he had seen in history books. Islam did not just suggest morality, it commanded it. Hassan recalled stories of Muslim rulers like Umar ibn Khattab R.A., who would walk the streets at night to ensure no one went hungry. He thought of the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, who forgave even his worst enemies. Is this what Islam truly teaches? Not just blind faith, but justice and righteousness. The pursuit of knowledge. Hassan then came across this verse. Read, "In the name of your Lord who created man from a clot." Read, "And your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not." Quran 96:1-5. This struck him deeply. The first command of the Quran was not to pray or fast, but to seek knowledge. He had always believed religion and science were opposed, but here was Islam commanding people to think, reflect, and learn. He researched further and discovered that the golden age of Islam had produced some of the greatest scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers, Ibn Sina, Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Biruni. It was Islam that had preserved and expanded human knowledge. Have I misunderstood faith all along? The reality of the afterlife. Despite his growing admiration for the Quran, Hassan still struggled with the idea of Akhirah, the afterlife. Could there really be a day of judgment? Then he read, "Does man think that we will not assemble his bones? Yes, we are able even to proportion his fingertips." Quran 75:3-4. He was startled. Why did the Quran specifically mention fingerprints? In the 7th century, no one knew that every human had a unique fingerprint, yet here it was. As he read more about the concept of accountability, he realized something. If there is no afterlife, then the oppressors of history get away with their crimes. The pharaohs, the dictators, the murderers, who will hold them accountable? The Quran's answer was clear: justice would be served, if not in this life, then in the next. Lessons from the past, the Prophet's struggles. Hassan was nearing the end of his journey when he found himself captivated by the stories of past prophets. A.S., a man who preached for 950 years, yet only a few believed. Ibrahim, A.S., a lone believer in a world of idol worshippers. Musa, A.S., a prophet who stood up to the greatest tyrant, Pharaoh. Yusuf, A.S., a young man betrayed by his own brothers, yet who later forgave them. These were not just stories. They were lessons about patience, faith, and resilience. The Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, himself had faced mockery, exile, war, and betrayal, yet he never abandoned his mission. Every prophet was tested. Maybe faith isn't about having an easy life, but about trusting in something greater, Hassan realized. A heart at peace. One night, Hassan walked along the Nile, the city lights reflecting on the water. He had started this journey as a skeptic, but now he felt something he had never felt before: clarity. Islam was not just about blind faith. It was about reason, justice, and purpose. He finally understood what the professor had meant in the cafe. Islam is not just a religion. It is a complete way of life. That night, he made sujud, prostration, for the first time in years. His heart whispered the words that had once seemed foreign to him. "Indeed, my prayer, my sacrifice, my life, and my death are for Allah, the Lord of the worlds." Quran 6:162. And in that moment, he felt at peace. The Quran and everyday life, a journey of transformation. A struggling soul. Aisha sat on her bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above her. It had been a long, exhausting day. Work pressure, family expectations, financial stress, everything felt overwhelming. She had always considered herself a practicing Muslim, but lately, life had become a routine of mechanical prayers and endless worries. Is this what faith is supposed to feel like? Shouldn't it bring peace? She wondered. That evening, as she scrolled through social media, she came across a video of a scholar discussing the power of the Quran in daily life. One sentence caught her attention. "We treat the Quran as a book of recitation, but not as a book of action. If we truly live by it, our lives will change." Something inside her stirred. Had she been reading the Quran without truly living it? The role of the Quran in worship. Determined to reconnect, Aisha decided to slow down in her prayers. Instead of rushing through Surah Al-Fatiha, she focused on each verse. "Guide us to the straight path." She repeated it softly, feeling the weight of those words. Was she truly seeking guidance, or just reciting without thought? The next morning, she woke up early for Far. This time, she didn't just pray, she listened to the Quran. As the reciter read, she felt something shift inside her. The peace she had been craving was right there, in the words she had been overlooking. That day, she made a promise to herself. She would try to live by the Quran, not just read it. Quranic morality in daily life. At work, Aisha noticed how competitive and harsh the environment had become. Gossip, backbiting, dishonesty, it was everywhere. She had fallen into the same habits, sometimes without realizing it. Then she read, "O you who have believed, avoid much suspicion. Indeed, some suspicion is sin. And do not spy or backbite one another." Quran 49:12. She felt a pang of guilt. That afternoon, when her colleagues started discussing someone's personal issues, she excused herself. If I truly believe in the Quran, I have to act on it, she thought. She also started setting aside money for charity. Instead of waiting for Ramadan, she followed the Quran's encouragement of regular tzedakah. Whoever gives in charity, even as small as a date, Allah will multiply it. At first, it was small, buying an extra meal for the office janitor, helping a struggling colleague. But soon, it became a habit, and she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Family, love, and justice. Aisha's biggest challenge, however, was at home. Her relationship with her younger brother, Omar, had become strained. He had made choices she didn't agree with, and she had been harsh in her judgments. Whenever they spoke, it turned into an argument. One night, she came across this verse. "And speak to people kindly." Quran 2 hours, 83 minutes. She paused. Had she been kind in her words? The next day, instead of criticizing Omar, she asked him about his struggles. He opened up in a way he never had before. "I always thought you looked down on me," he admitted. Aisha realized that justice in family life wasn't just about pointing out mistakes. It was also about patience, kindness, and understanding, self-reflection, and spiritual growth. Weeks passed, and Aisha noticed a change. Life was still challenging, but her heart felt lighter. She spent time reflecting on herself instead of focusing on others' flaws. She started journaling Quranic lessons she could apply in her life. One day, she wrote, "The Quran is not just a book I read. It's a mirror I hold up to my soul." As she continued her journey, she realized that true peace doesn't come from a perfect life. It comes from aligning one's life with divine wisdom. And in that realization, she finally found the peace she had been searching for all along. Bridging Hearts, a journey of understanding. A coffee shop encounter. It was a cold winter afternoon in London. Aisha, now deeply connected with the Quran, sat in a quiet coffee shop, flipping through the pages of her small pocket-sized mushaf. She had started keeping it with her, not just for reading, but as a reminder to live by its principles. As she took a sip of her tea, she heard a voice beside her. "Excuse me, is that the Quran you're reading?" She turned to see an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Yes, it is," Aisha responded politely. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've always been curious about it," the woman continued. "I'm Margaret, by the way." Aisha smiled, sensing genuine curiosity. "Not at all, Margaret. I'd be happy to share," she replied. A conversation across faiths. Margaret took a seat across from Aisha, her wrinkled hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "I've read bits of the Bible all my life," she said, "but I don't know much about the Quran. How is it different?" Aisha thought for a moment before responding. The Quran speaks to all of humanity. It acknowledges previous scriptures like the Torah and the Gospel, and it speaks about the people of the book, Jews and Christians, with deep respect. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Really? I always assumed it was just for Muslims." Aisha opened her mushaf and gently turned to a verse. "Say, O people of the book, come to a common word between us and you, that we worship none but God." Quran 3 hours, 64 minutes. Margaret read the words and nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like something Jesus would say." Aisha smiled. "That's because we believe Jesus, peace be upon him, was a great prophet sent by God. In fact, there's an entire chapter in the Quran named after his mother, Mary. Margaret's eyes widened. Mary? The mother of Jesus? Yes, Aisha confirmed. The Quran describes her as one of the most honored women in history. Margaret took a deep breath, clearly processing this new information. You know, she said after a pause, this isn't what I hear in the news. They make it sound like your faith is completely different from mine. Aisha sighed. Unfortunately, people focus more on differences than similarities. But the Quran encourages us to engage in dialogue, not conflict. Finding common ground. Margaret stirred her coffee, then leaned forward. What about tolerance? How does your book talk about people who aren't Muslim? Aisha turned to another verse and read aloud. There is no compulsion in religion. Quran 2:256. It means faith is a choice. No one should be forced to believe. Our responsibility is only to share the message with kindness. Margaret nodded slowly. That's beautiful. I wish more people understood that. She looked at Aisha with a thoughtful expression. You know, my grandson is marrying a Muslim girl next month. I wasn't sure how to feel about it, but after talking to you, I think I'll try to understand her faith better. Aisha's heart warmed. That's all that matters, understanding. At the end of the day, we're all seeking truth and peace in our own ways. A new perspective. As they finished their conversation, Margaret reached out and gently touched Aisha's hand. Thank you for this. I came here for coffee, but I'm leaving with something much more valuable. Aisha smiled. And I'm leaving with hope that conversations like these can bring hearts closer. As Margaret walked away, Aisha looked at the Quran in her hands. It was not just a book of recitation, it was a book of connection, of dialogue, of building bridges between people. And today, in a small coffee shop in London, it had done just that. The Scholar's Dilemma. A lecture that sparked controversy. Dr. Omar Siddiqui had spent his life studying the Quran. As a professor of Islamic studies, he had dedicated decades to exploring its meanings, historical context, and modern interpretations. But nothing had prepared him for the storm that was about to hit. It all started with a university lecture. Dr. Omar had been invited to speak at a panel discussion on religion in the modern world at a prestigious European university. He spoke passionately about how Quranic interpretation has evolved over time and how it should be understood within its historical and linguistic context rather than through isolated verses. But as soon as the discussion ended, an angry student stood up. Dr. Omar, isn't it true that the Quran promotes violence? What about the verses about jihad? The student demanded. A murmur spread across the hall. Some nodded in agreement. Others waited for his response. Dr. Omar took a deep breath. He had faced this question countless times before. Jihad, he began, is one of the most misunderstood concepts in the Quran. The word itself means struggle, not just in battle, but in all aspects of life. The Quran speaks of jihad against ignorance, against injustice, against one's own ego. He paused and then added, yes, there are verses about warfare, but they came at a time when Muslims were under attack. Even then, the Quran commands fairness. Fight those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, God does not like transgressors. Quran 2:190. The room was silent. The backlash. The next morning, Dr. Omar woke up to dozens of emails. Some praised his lecture, but others were filled with anger. One headline caught his attention. Islamic scholar defends controversial Quranic verses. He sighed. The media had twisted his words, making it sound as if he were justifying extremism. Later that day, he received a call from the university administration. Dr. Omar, we've had complaints. Some students feel uncomfortable with what was discussed. Uncomfortable, he asked, trying to stay calm. Because I explained the Quran with historical context. They believe you avoided the hard truths. Some even say you were defensive. Dr. Omar rubbed his forehead. The hard truth, he said slowly, is that too many people read the Quran without understanding Arabic, without understanding history, and without considering the original context. A conversation with doubt. That evening, his own son, Zaid, confronted him. Baba, why do you even bother? No one wants to understand the Quran properly. People either misinterpret it on purpose or reject it entirely. Dr. Omar smiled. I understand your frustration, Zaid. But do you know why misunderstandings happen? Zaid shook his head. Because the Quran wasn't revealed in English or French. It was revealed in Arabic, a deep, poetic, multi-layered language. Every translation loses some meaning. And when people isolate verses without context, they create their own meaning. Zaid frowned. So what's the solution? Dr. Omar picked up his Quran from the table. The solution is education. The Prophet PBUH said, "The best among you are those who learn the Quran and teach it." If we don't teach the correct understanding, others will spread their own versions, some out of ignorance, some out of malice. The determination to continue. The backlash didn't stop Dr. Omar. The controversy only made him more determined. He started a new online series, explaining misunderstood Quranic verses, breaking down gender equality, jihad, religious freedom, and more, all through historical and linguistic analysis. Within weeks, thousands of people, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, began following his lectures. Some criticized, some questioned, but many finally understood. One day, he received an email from a woman in Canada. Dr. Omar, I used to think the Quran was oppressive. But after watching your explanation on gender rights, I see how much it actually promotes justice. Thank you for changing my perspective. Dr. Omar smiled. This was why he continued. Misinterpretations would always exist. Criticism would never stop. But as long as there were people seeking truth, his mission was far from over. The Digital Quran Revolution. A new way to connect. In a quiet cafe in Istanbul, Aisha scrolled through her phone, reading the Quran on a beautifully designed mobile app. The interface was smooth, translations were available in multiple languages, and there was even an option to listen to different recitations. Just a decade ago, she never imagined studying the Quran could be this easy. Growing up, she had struggled with Arabic, relying on old translations that didn't always make sense. But now, technology had transformed everything. Her thoughts were interrupted by a notification, a live session with Sheikh Rami, a renowned scholar on YouTube. He was discussing how technology had reshaped the way people engaged with the Quran. The rise of digital Islam. Aisha joined the live session. Sheikh Rami was explaining how digital platforms had made the Quran more accessible than ever before. Today, anyone with a smartphone can read, listen, and learn the Quran from anywhere in the world, he said. We have interactive tafsir websites, AI-powered translations, and even VR experiences that take you back to the era of revelation. Aisha smiled. She had recently seen a VR project that recreated Mecca during the time of the Prophet PBUH, allowing users to walk through its streets and witness the historical events of Islam. But with every blessing comes a challenge. Sheikh Rami continued. Misinformation is spreading too. People take isolated verses, post them out of context, and mislead others. It's our responsibility to use technology wisely. Aisha nodded. She had seen it happen. Quotes from the Quran twisted to justify violence, oppression, and discrimination. Faith in the age of social media. Later that evening, Aisha's younger brother, Bilal, barged into her room, frustrated. Aisha, look at this. He shoved his phone in front of her. A viral video was claiming that Islam was against women's rights, using selective Quranic verses as proof. Why do people believe these things? Bilal asked. Aisha sighed. Because they don't bother to learn the full context. The Quran speaks about justice, respect, and equality. But some people either misinterpret it or spread lies. Bilal frowned. Then why don't scholars fight back? They do, Aisha replied, showing him the website of an Islamic AI chatbot designed to answer people's questions about the Quran. But people have to be willing to listen. The Quran's influence beyond religion. The next day, Aisha attended an exhibition on Islamic art and architecture. She admired the breathtaking calligraphy, intricate designs inspired by Quranic verses, and digital projections that blended tradition with modern creativity. One display caught her attention, a holographic image of Alhambra's Quranic inscriptions. She touched a screen, and the calligraphy translated into multiple languages, revealing messages of peace, wisdom, and divine guidance. Amazing, isn't it? A voice said beside her. She turned to see an elderly professor. The Quran's influence isn't just in religion, he continued. It's in law, justice, art, culture, and even diplomacy. Many principles of human rights and governance in today's world echo Quranic teachings. Aisha thought about that. Even in the United Nations discussions on justice and peace, principles of fairness and equality reflected what the Quran had taught centuries ago. A responsibility for the future. That night, Aisha made a decision. She had always wanted to contribute to society, but wasn't sure how. Now she knew she would create a digital platform to teach the Quran with historical and cultural insights, addressing modern misconceptions. As she started sketching ideas, she felt hopeful. The Quran was not just an ancient book, it was alive in the modern world, shaping minds, inspiring creativity, and guiding humanity toward justice. And through technology, it would continue to reach hearts in ways never imagined before. The Timeless Guide. A night of reflection. Under the vast desert sky, amid the quiet rustling of the palm trees, an old scholar named Abdul Rahman sat in the courtyard of his home in Medina. His grandson Yusuf had just returned from university abroad and was deep in thought. "You seem troubled," Abdul Rahman observed, setting down his worn-out copy of the Quran. Yusuf hesitated before speaking. "Grandfather, I've been thinking. In today's world, where science and technology are advancing so fast, does the Quran still hold the same relevance? I see people debating about it. Some claim it's outdated, while others say it's the only way forward." Abdul Rahman smiled, as if he had been expecting this question. "Come with me," he said, rising to his feet. The Eternal Message. They walked through the narrow streets of Medina, passing by ancient mosques and modern buildings, standing side by side. "Yusuf," the old man said, "when I was your age, I had the same questions. But the more I studied the Quran, the more I realized it's not just a book of rules. It's a way of life." They stopped at a bustling marketplace, where merchants greeted customers with warmth. "Look around you," Abdul Rahman continued. "Fair trade, honesty in business, kindness to customers. These are all Quranic principles. The world changes, but morality doesn't." Yusuf nodded, remembering a discussion from his university class about ethics in business. It fascinated him how modern laws on fairness and justice mirrored what the Quran had taught centuries ago. More than just recitation. They reached a mosque, where a group of young children was learning to recite the Quran. Their voices echoed softly through the hall. "Many people think the Quran is just for reading," Abdul Rahman said, watching the children. "But Allah sent it for action. A man may memorize every word, but if he doesn't live by it, what has he gained?" Yusuf thought of all the times he had seen people reciting Quranic verses, but ignoring their meaning. It made sense now. Reading was just the first step. "So, the Quran is not just to be read, but to be lived?" he asked. "Exactly," his grandfather replied. "It is a mirror. It reflects who we are and guides us to who we should be." A universal invitation. As they walked back home, the evening call to prayer filled the air. The words of the Adhan were the same ones called out in every corner of the world. Unchanged, unwavering. The Quran is not just for Muslims, Yusuf. It is for all of humanity. It calls people to think, to reflect, and to act with justice. Some may accept it, some may reject it, but the message remains. They reached their courtyard, where Abdul Rahman picked up his old copy of the Quran again. "Every generation must rediscover it," he said. "It is not the Quran that needs to change. It is we who need to open our hearts and see it with new eyes." Yusuf sat beside him, feeling a strange sense of peace. For the first time, he truly understood. The Quran was not just a historical text. It was a conversation between the Creator and His creation, guiding them through every age. And no matter how much the world changed, its message would always remain.